from, and space and time, from no space, no time, no stars, no anything. It sounds like it requires divine intervention to get all this stuff when there's no stuff, but it turns out the laws of physics, as we understand them, and just gently extrapolated, but as we understand them, allow for the possibility of creating a universe where everything that we see did not exist and then came into existence. Moreover, if you ask what would be the characteristics of a universe that popped into existence with no space, no time, no matter, no radiation, everything else to begin with, and then suddenly a universe with space, time, matter, radiation, what would be the characteristics of such a universe if it lived 10 billion or 14 billion years? Turns out the characteristics of that universe would look precisely like our universe. Does that prove that our universe came from nothing? Absolutely not. But it shows that not only that it's plausible, but highly suggestive. And what it really means is that you don't need any supernatural shenanigans to explain how to get us from nothing. There's no need for any supernatural entities. And anytime you can remove that, that's a good thing. You can explain how we got here just by natural laws of science. And I liken it without the same pretense. I don't want me to sound pretentious in this sense. But when we don't understand all the details of exactly what happened at t=0, but we can argue plausibly from what we know and come up with what we see. It's really the same in that sense as when Charles Darwin developed evolution. He didn't know about the details of genetics or DNA or the human genome or any animal's genome. So there's a lot at the fundamental level he didn't know, but he demonstrated that the evidence was that you could get the diversity of species we see on Earth from simple beginnings by natural selection and mutations within a species, that those could naturally arise without any supernatural shenanigans in terms of everything we see. Moreover, all of the evidence that he collected, and of course all the evidence in the intervening 150 odd years, has been completely consistent with the predictions of that hypothesis. Just like all the evidence about the universe we see is completely consistent with the hypothesis that there's no intelligent design behind the universe as we see it. So that's maybe a rough summary of what that book was about.
No, and I like that fact that you had mentioned in your book that things make predictions. Like one of the things, like Wolfgang Pauli had predicted the neutrino long before we knew that it existed. He looked at beta decay and said, "Hey, something's wrong here. We have to have conservation of the energy, momentum, and lepton number." And all he says, it has to be right. And so the same thing with Derek, he posited antimatter. Right, it has to exist. Now, I think you wrote this in your book, and this is new to me, that he actually posited the proton to be the antimatter to the electron, which I think is bizarre.
Yeah, he as
he
later on said, his equation was smarter than he was.
Right.
Because he, at the time, it was at a time when postulating the existence of new elementary particles was radical. Now it happens all the time. In the intervening time, we've discovered new particles all the time. And by the way, when Pauli invented or proposed the neutrino, I'm not sure he really believed it. He just said, this is what a radical thing that seems to be required, but until experiment demonstrated, or at least until other experiments indirectly suggested it was there, I'm not sure he believed it. But Dirac, this equation predicted the existence of antiparticles for all the particles we see, but he wasn't bold enough to suggest that was the case because no one had ever discovered new particles. But within 2 or 3 years of the time of that development of that equation, lots of new particles were discovered, including the antiparticle of the electron. And then, of course, over the 1950s, every time you banged new particles together at accelerators, other new particles created. And it would seem like there was no end or no rhyme or reason. It looked like it was just a soup of an infinite number of elementary particles. And one of the great things that I actually talk about in the book after The Universe from Nothing, but in The Greatest Story Ever Told, is how what our revolution was like at the fundamental smallest scales, not just the largest scales. And it's really an unsung story that our picture has changed more in the last 50 years than it did even before that with the developments of special relativity and quantum mechanics. We now understand this incredibly exotic world of elementary particle physics, and in fact the world around us, in terms of 4 basic forces, 3 of which we understand precisely. And gravity, we understand not quantum mechanically, but classically. It's just an amazing development from the time I was a high school student and almost from the time I was a university student. At that time, we understood one of the four forces in nature. And now we understand three precisely, and we're trying to understand gravity a little more. And that's an amazing development in a single human lifetime. And of course, during that process, we took a world with lots of elementary particles that seemed to have no rhyme or reasons, and we now understand at a fundamental level, as far as we can see, there are these things called quarks, and there are these other particles which you mentioned called leptons, of which the electron is a particle, and that basically makes up, and then there are particles that convey the four forces, and this extra weird particle or set of particles called the Higgs particle. And that's it, as far as we can tell. That explains everything we've ever been able to see. It's an amazing triumph of the human intellect. And it saddens me that more people don't appreciate it, because it's really as poetic and beautiful as anything else humans have ever done. And
yeah, and the reason I brought that up is we have creationists who watch our show. I hate to say, but I'm actually friends with some of them. I mean, I don't think that.
Well, there's no reason not to be friends with people. Just I disagree with them.
Exactly. And I'm really into building bridges, because I think that a lot of them.
I'm going to interrupt you one more time. Let me interrupt you one more time to reveal something that many of you may not know. There's a person who all of you are undoubtedly fans of, a late friend of mine, Christopher Hitchens, who of course debated creationists and many occasions, and debated believers in many occasions. But on a personal level, he was the most tolerant person I've ever known. He would regularly have to dinner at his house people who I would have a hard time being in the same building with. And his feeling was, I think that as individuals, you can respect someone as a human being and disagree with him completely. And he was a bulldog on stage, but he was an incredibly tolerant human being. So anyway, go on.
No, he was so classy. He was so classy.
Yeah, and he had a wonderful
accent. You have no idea
how
much shit I get for being friends with Saitan Brunicate. Okay, so yeah, I get that. Trust me. Yeah, I mean, I get along with the guy. I honestly do. But anyways, the reason I bring that up is because of the creationists in the audience. When you make predictions, right? You were saying that these are the things that the mathematics are indicating, and so these are indicative of future things, like when we predicted the things like dark matter, right? Dark energy. These are things that are necessitated by the mathematics. So can you kind of explain to the listeners why is it that they're not just magical things out there?
Well, they're not just not magical, but one of the things that many creationists say, especially young Earth creationists, is this illusion that somehow astronomy and paleontology, for example, are historical sciences. But they're no more historical than physics or chemistry. In the sense, it's true that many of the things you do in astronomy and paleontology is to study things previously. But that's exactly what we do in the laboratory. What's really important is, based on what you see, you then make predictions about observations you have not yet made. You make predictions about fossils that you haven't yet seen. You may make predictions about the genetic relationships of mammals that you haven't yet tested by measuring their DNA. So even though you're looking at an evolutionary process that happened backwards in time, you're making predictions about observations that have not yet been done and could falsify your theory. And the same is true in astronomy and cosmology. Of course, we're trying to understand the ancient history of the universe, and it's true what they say, that people weren't around then, but that doesn't matter. Based on what we observe and the models we build, we can make predictions about things we haven't yet seen. And there are dozens of such predictions that we can test. The theory becomes falsifiable because we can make these predictions about things we haven't yet seen, whether it's the nature of dark energy or how large the early fluctuations would have been in the cosmic microwave background, and what we would expect to see about when galaxies formed. So all of these things, we're opening up new windows all the time with the Hubble Space Telescope and the Next Generation Space Telescope and the other satellites that have been set up, the new planet discovering satellites. So we're making tons of we have predictions, but we're in a golden age of observation where we can now make new tests of predictions we never thought would be testable. When I was even a young professor, I never thought we'd ever be able to know the expansion rate of the universe to the precision we do. I never thought we'd be able to directly see the early fluctuations in the microwave background, that we'd be able to measure the curvature of the universe. All of these things seemed like science fiction as a theorist, even though we made predictions about them. And I'm amazed that now we've been able to turn cosmology into a precision science where we can measure things not to an order of magnitude or a factor of 2, but in some cases to 5 decimal places, and compare that with the predictions of theory.
I personally have this is going to be more of a technical question, and only because I may never get a chance to ask you, so I'm going to throw it out there. Hopefully, it won't confuse the audience. But reading something like this, and I'm a little bit familiar with the topic. It's one of the things that's most difficult to wrap your head around. So I'm thinking that maybe people that have experienced this as well might have a hard time with this. And this goes with the concept of the free lunch. And so when you have this universe that's expanding and it's increasing in volume, and you have an energy distribution that's constant, but you have a total net energy going up, then you basically are. It seems like you're getting something from nothing.
You're getting something from nothing. Well, you are, yeah, but in a legal way.
It's hard to wrap your head around from that, though. It's like, how do you have this increase of energy out of nothing?
I'll tell you how. It won't satisfy you, but I'll tell you how. So it turns out the energy of empty space not only has energy, but it has pressure. Now, in elementary physics, you learn that when you have an expanding gas, or when you move some system, the work done is the pressure times the change in volume. That's elementary physics. But empty space has negative pressure if it has energy. And what it means is that as it's expanding, work is being done on empty space, not by empty space. And that work that's being done goes into precisely increasing the total energy contained in any volume as the volume increases. So it's the fact that there's this weird negative pressure that when space expands, instead of doing work, like when I blow up a balloon, all the particles in the balloon are doing work on the balloon to make it expand, okay? And they're doing work, and some of that work energy that they're doing gets released as heat and other things. But when the universe expands, instead of work being done by the expanding universe, work is being done on the expanding universe because of the negative pressure, and that's dumping energy into empty space so that there's more space, and empty space, the energy density of empty space remains constant, the volume increases, and therefore the total energy in some large volume increases. But that's because work's being done on empty space. I know it doesn't really, it may not seem to explain anything, but that's the physics and the mathematics of it.
It does, and ironically, somebody actually in our audience actually wanted that question asked, so you're welcome. No, it does, but it's somebody. It's really difficult to have a paradigm shift. Like, for example, my background was more classical. I operated nuclear power plants. I trained people to operate nuclear power plants. I'm straight billiard balls and electron going roundy around nucleus kind of stuff, right? Well, I mean, I get the other stuff, but I'm old-fashioned. Yeah. So when you have to do this paradigm shift, and you have to think in a way of dealing with negative pressures and stuff like even negative gravity, if you can maybe touch on that. If you have, let's say you don't have a situation where you have potential energy converted to kinetic energy. You're not dropping something, but two spheres out in space somewhere, and they just have their own gravitational force, and they're being brought together by kinetic energy, or the kinetic energy is going up because they're being brought together. Now you've got to offset that with negative gravity. That's something that
potential energy goes down. No, that's pretty simple. But let me just say, look.
No, for some people, I get it. Okay. For some people, they have wrapping around.
I'll try and explain it. But look, the point is that none of this having a new window on the universe and a new picture of the universe doesn't come easily. It's not supposed to come easily, in the sense that, as I've often said, one of the purposes of education and science is to make you uncomfortable. Because if you're not uncomfortable, you're not expanding your horizons. And so every time we learn something about the universe, it may surprise us, and it takes us a long time to get our heads around it. And it's not surprising that some of these radical new ideas are hard to comprehend. You shouldn't feel bad if they are. They're hard for physicists to comprehend. And it takes time to get your mind around them, and generations. Often, Max Planck once said that physics proceeds one funeral at a time. Namely, the next generation finds it easier to understand the things that the generation before found very difficult. But the decrease in energy when things are falling together is not too surprising, because it's true. If I take this water bottle and I drop it, okay, it speeds up. but then it